Is science bad? Well, if fictional pirate comic One Piece is to be believed, then science has not traditionally been portrayed as a force for good, which is epitomized by the world's warrior god of science being a very evil demonic spider devil. But even before we got to him, One Piece has had a pretty troubling history with science. On Thriller Bark, we met one of the world's most renowned of sciencemen, Dr. Hogback, and what he did right was he dug up the corpse of a woman he was stalking and reanimated her into his plate slave. Score 1 for science and less than 1 for general morality. Caesar Clown on Punk Hazard was contracted by Charlotte Linlin to perform gigantification experiments on children, but decided to piss that money away on implied escorts, and used what little he had left over to perform the research in the most brutal and inhumane way possible. Then we have Queen, real name Cyan, as in science, who pursued this science for his hobby of creating new and fun diseases to kill people in ever interestingly new and unusual ways. Meanwhile, Vince Smoke Judge elected to genetically alter his own children to strip away their emotions and turn them into efficient killing machines. Miss Buckingham Stussy cloned herself and cloned her alleged lover in order to serve as her son, and Dr. Indigo farts whenever he walks, which is really annoying to do for an entire movie. And finally, the aforementioned J. Garcia Saturn, the epitome of the evil of science, dedicated his research purely to systematically dismantling the human race. Science has a bit of a rough history in One Piece, and even Dr. Vegapunk, the goodest of the good science men, was not immune from this. Again, he is the most nicest of science men, but even he recognizes the base desire for greed, violence, and evil within him, and saw fit to give each of those impulses their own body to carry out said impulses. And Oda chose Egghead Island as the arc to explore his complicated feelings about science, approaching the discussion from two polar opposite beliefs with Vegapunk and Saint Saturn. One of the biggest differences between these two men is that Vegapunk, despite his status, always refers to himself as but a humble scientist. He uses this language a lot, such as when he apologized to Bonnie, calling himself nothing more than a hired scientist, as opposed to J. Garcia Saturn, who claims to be and genuinely believes himself to be a god. So the two have fundamentally different approaches to science. Vegapunk, as a humble man, has great respect for the wonders of the world around him, while Saturn has great disdain for that same world. The two are also a tale of resources. There's a common theme with the Vegapunk stating how under-resourced they are, and how much they're able to produce despite that, while Saint Saturn has effectively infinite resources and manages to produce nothing of worth. In fact, he creates negative value. Saturn used the infinite resources available to him to research and implement the suffering of a single man, whilst Vegapunk used his limited resources to benefit all mankind. Vegapunk is also generally inspired by the good of those around him. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for creating GP flowers, which convert gunpowder into flowers and prevent the firing of weapons. And as of right now, the only character we know of who uses these would be Hibari, but this right here is a big step towards world peace by forcibly disarming combatants. And decades later, Vegapunk would switch his focus to bubble tech, inventing bubble shields for the pacifista and bubble guns to capture and pacify people within bubbles. And he chose Bartholomew Kuma to be the basis of his pacifista peace project. He even named them after Kuma, labeling himself as a pacifist, and even hiring Sentomaru as a bodyguard who claims to have the world's greatest defense. Everything that Vegapunk does is for the pursuit of peace and protection, which is awkward because he's being employed by a man charged with achieving the opposite. If Vegapunk pursues science to protect all mankind and see it prosper, then Saturn practices science for the sake of exterminating humans. Think of human lives as nothing more than insects. They will always breed more to make up for any loss, and one of the few times we do see Saturn express any kind of regret is when the pacifista are ordered to eliminate the Sea Beast weapons. This makes Saturn somewhat sad because the Sea Beasts were exceptional weapons that could have been put to fantastic exterminatory use. And there is a real strong temptation to view the dynamic of Vegapunk and Saturn as good versus evil, man we like versus man we really don't like, but that is not the case at all. And Jewelry Bonnie says as much when she reunites with Vegapunk, stating, "Your endless quest for scientific knowledge will spare no one in its greed," which in retrospect was some pretty amazing foreshadowing for York's betrayal by specifically flagging that greed was the issue. And Bonnie was obviously saying this because at the time she blamed Vegapunk for what happened to her father. But here's the thing, she's not wrong. Vegapunk may have had good intentions at heart, but he is not morally exempt at all. In fact, I would describe him as more morally abstaining. Yes, he does try to do the right thing whenever he's actively in control, but it's the secondary effects of his actions which can often have devastating consequences. The development of the pacifista, Vegapunk's Legion of Peace. This peace force have quelled and killed countless people since since they were created and put in the hands of the world government. Then Vegapunk's discovery of the lineage factor was a massive breakthrough, but it was also one that opened a very dangerous door that a lot of nefarious individuals rushed through, such as Vin Smoke Judge using it to alter his own children, or Caesar clumsily using the concept to try and gigantify children for Big Mom. Even the more simple stuff like figuring out how to align the bottom of marine ships with sea stone so they can travel through the calm belt, at first that seems harmless. It's just an extension of freedom, but what it's done is it has allowed the world government a significant strategic advantage that no other force can measure up to and increased their stranglehold on the planet. And Vegapunk also has the responsibility of Lelucia on his rather massive head, as yes, York is the one who stole a sample of the Mother Flame and gave it to the Elders, allowing the ancient weapon Uranus to be used on the Lelucia kingdom, but York literally is Vegapunk. She's not a completely separate entity. Everything present within her also exists within him, and it's just like Jewelry Bonnie said, your endless quest will spare no one in its greed. Earlier when I was drawing a contrast to Saturn, I was also tempted to make the point that Saturn experiments on unwilling subjects like Ginny, whereas Vegapunk makes a point of asking for consent like he did with Kuma. However, I'm not sure if that argument still stands with the existence of the Seraphim, 6 of which were created from the DNA of people who had not consented to be cloned, much less have those clones turned into weaponized servants with no free will of their own. Ownership of DNA is one of those debates that even we as a society still have yet to properly do, and I don't think that Eiichiro Oda intended to take part in that discussion with his fictional pirate comic. If he did, I would think that Jinbei would have had a much stronger reaction to seeing S-Shark. As it is, he's just a bit shocked and highly amused at S-Snake and how much she resembles Boa Hancock's personality. But fictionally, realistically, he'd probably have quite a strong reaction to a fishman being cloned for the purpose of effectively being a slave, given the history of his people. And one of Vegapunk's other more questionable dreams has to do with punk records, a big old library that people could continue to update long after he's gone. To which Jinbei quickly asked whether that would be an issue if this power was put in the wrong hands and this library was corrupted by an ideology, because in that case you would be able to control the world's supply of knowledge and weaponize it for that given ideology. And that's essentially what's happened in the One Piece world already. The world government has a near monopoly on knowledge to the point where they have managed to edit out a whole century's worth of history and then lie and insert their own ideological history as time has gone on. But in response to this concern, Vegapunk says, "Well, Jinbei, first son of the sea, that's a very smart question to be asking. But science will never advance if you spend all of your time worrying about it, so just don't worry, mate. Stop asking questions." Which I personally don't find to be a very comforting answer. But that is the Vegapunk philosophy, which he makes clear in his message to the world, where he refuses to opine over which side was good and which side was evil. That is not for science to decide. And that makes the dynamic of Vegapunk and Saint Saturn more one of objectivity versus bias. Vegapunk has no preconceived notions of anything. Any thought that he has in his colossal apple brain has to undergo rigorous experimentation and confirmation before he'll accept it. Whereas Saturn is using science for the purpose of lies. It is his mission to obscure the quest for truth, not very science of him. Science itself is morally neutral. It can do great good and it can do great harm. And the discussion of how much of each of those can be attributed to the individual scientist is quite nuanced, but I don't think that's the discussion that Oda was trying to have. The battle between Dr. Vegapunk and Saint Saturn was one of truth, and in that regard, they do actually have something in common. Something that makes Mr. Saint Saturn something of a hypocrite, as you may remember when he said, "Why is it that human beings feel the need to do what they are explicitly forbidden from doing?" That is a fantastic question, and one that he very much should have been able to answer himself, because the one big thing that Vegapunk and Saint Saturn have in common is an interest in the forbidden, and they even share a common research project. 200 years ago, Saturn and his scientists were ordered to dispose of Emmet after he attacked Marijois, but Saturn sneakily kept Emmet out of a profound desire to research the forbidden and to use it for the good of the world government, I'm sure, yes. But that good intention resulted in profoundly negative ramifications for them, much like a lot of Vegapunk's research has. Saturn said, "Why is it that these stupid human beings feel the need to do the thing they're forbidden from doing?" And then he goes off and does the same thing. I imagine that he doesn't include himself in the definition of human. He probably sees his own interest in the forbidden as above that of a human. As a god, I can do the forbidden thing. You can't. Stop it. But I can. Although Oda also includes a panel of his very human scientists thanking Saturn for being allowed to keep Emmet, with their faces lighting up with pure joy at the opportunity to research this forbidden technology. Which, a couple of centuries later, is the decision that eventually allowed Vegapunk to do the same. And in a weird way, that's pretty perfectly representative of what science is meant to be. Each new generation of scientists begin their quest for truth by standing on the shoulder of the giants who came before them. On that and that occasion alone, Saint Saturn displayed the qualities of a scientist, which is what ended up dooming him, showing us that his role in this world was never about science to begin with. And in addition to the general idea of truth, Egghead Island also plays with the idea of fact versus faith, stepping a bit into that area of traditional conflict between science and religion, but I think that calling it faith is more accurate. Vegapunk is a man of fierce fact science who during his journey learns to practice faith, and he trusts neither of those concepts blindly. His science must be rigorously proven and tested, and his faith must, at the very least, have a demonstrable hypothesis behind it. He's quite consistently shocked by the inbuilt abilities of human beings, whether that's the Seraphim displaying capabilities beyond his expectations, or the surprising actions of the shell of Bartholomew Kuma. Vegapunk doesn't have an answer to how a lot of the phenomena happening around him are happening, but he's seen enough to put a pretty hefty bet of faith in humanity as a whole. On the other hand, Saint Saturn has no faith in humanity. He believes it to be fragile and inferior, which is fascinating because these two scientists had another joint experiment to prove each other's views, and that experiment was Mr. Bartholomew Kuma. Saturn was supremely confident that he could strip Kuma's humanity away completely without even understanding or wanting to understand what humanity is, which is a question that Vegapunk still struggles with, but at least he is trying to answer it, and he even tried to quantify the concept of free will. Losing free will in this research project means losing all of the memories and human emotions you've gained to this point in your life. And Vegapunk was wrong about that, because even after losing all of that, Kuma is still able to practice free will, but what that means is that Vegapunk was right about humanity in general, as Kuma's shell did still retain enough humanity to punch Saint Saturn in the face to save Bonnie, meaning that Saturn's experiment was an abysmal failure. Saturn is a man who practices blind faith and fundamentally incurious science. None of what he does goes through a process of rigorous testing, and it's almost as if Saturn gets bored of an experiment as soon as he detects the slightest sign of failure, which must make his life very boring because everything he's ever done is a failure. The Sapphire Scales disease was a result of his failure to create an unknown desired outcome. His gutting of Kuma was a failure because he still retained his humanity. Saturn's decision to retain Emmett and weaponize him was the failure that ultimately got him killed by Emu, and the one experiment that was a success was imbuing Bonnie with her devil fruit. However, that success was turned into a failure when that directly led to the Egghead incident. Meanwhile, Vegapunk's greatest failure was a perfectly cloned devil fruit coming out pink instead of blue, and he's taken that failure quite hard. But I would also say that the very existence of Saturn also stands very much in opposition to science, because so much of Saint Saturn is magic coded, and yeah, there's the fun Arthur C. Clarke quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, but mate, when there is a pentagram with a spider demon coming out of it, I don't care, we are calling it magic. There was also a very sneaky Kuma line foreshadowing Saturn in his flashback. I would make a deal with you to save Bonnie's life, even if you were the devil himself. And I think that's part of what makes Saturn such a bad science man. Vegapunk wasn't gifted with supernatural powers by a strange dark entity with big old mega milkers sitting on the empty throne, so Vegapunk had to fully investigate science to reach any of his desires. He had to be curious about everything to build anything, whereas Saturn was assumedly born into limitless resources as well as granted world-class power by Emu. And what can science do for a man like that? That's why all he ever does are these macabre experiments, to see if he can kill someone in a slightly different way than all of the other ways he can naturally already kill them. And to be as fair as I can to Saint Saturn, which isn't much, but it's probably very difficult to be curious when you already believe yourself to be a god. Because what god is gonna waste time dicking around with the periodic table when they can just snap their fingers and make almost anything happen? Which is another distinction I should make. Saturn has a god complex, all of the world nobles do, but acknowledging the existence of a god, as long as it's not yourself, doesn't necessarily stop science and faith from being a good marriage. In fact, many of the more advanced civilizations in One Piece strike this balance rather well, like the most medically advanced island in the world, the Torino Kingdom, still maintaining its traditional values, or the dial technology developed in the extremely pious Skypiea. Elbaf also has something to say about this with their advancements in scientifically conjuring rainbows to travel across, and the Great Kingdom itself, the most advanced civilization in recorded history, is implied to have worshipped the sun god, and that feels quite intentional on Oda's part. I think it makes a lot of sense that these older, more traditional nations do have that technological edge, because the older you are, the closer you were to the Void Century, a time after which technology has mostly regressed, or at the very least stagnated. Whenever we see a flashback that occurs a few hundred years in the past, such as Nolan's story, it's pretty frightening just how little things seem to have changed in terms terms of technology, because we step back 400 years to that time, and if you didn't tell me it was 400 years ago, it would seem like the modern day. And so Vegapunk is a man whose mind was said to be living 500 years in the future, but it's more like he was living 800 years in the past, and that the world has been frozen in place for that entire time. A state that has now only changed thanks to Dr. Vegapunk's truth dissemination and the death of the very obstructive bad science man, J. Garcia Saturn.